Hi, welcome all Chayalim to the Mitzvah Maven Mitzvah Shiurim, learning each mitzvah of the 613 mitzvahs from the Sarah Yahadus curriculum. In this year, we're going to be learning the mitzvahs in book number 3. That's for all Chayalim in grade 6 who are participating in the Mitzvah Maven track. We are going to begin by opening our books to unit 100 and to the mitzvahs of that unit on page 12. The first mitzvah of this unit has two parts to the mitzvah. As we'll see in the mitzvah itself, there are two aspects to the mitzvah, one that applies specifically in Eretz Yisrael, and the second part of the mitzvah that applies in all places in the world, Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. The name of the mitzvah is Shillelagh Zroya Kilei Zroim Ba'aretz V'Shalei Narkiv Ilan B'Shul Mokem. Do not grow two different kinds of seeds together in Eretz Yisrael, or graft trees together anywhere. Now this mitzvah is a mitzvah of kilayim. Kilayim means planting or sowing seeds together of different species, different types of seeds or plants, mixing them together so that way they grow as one joined plant. In this mitzvah, there is one part which is not to grow different seeds of different species in Eretz Yisrael, which means we're not allowed to take, for example, a wheat kernel together with a tomato seed and plant it together in Eretz Yisrael. The second part of this mitzvah is that we're not allowed to graft two different types of trees together anywhere. Grafting means that you take a part of one tree, for example, a branch, and you combine it, you join it with another tree. For example, you would take a branch from one tree and you make a hole in another tree and you fit the branch in, and then the trees join together, very similar to like when a person has a cast and the bones join together to become one. So the tree joins together with this new branch and fruits grow off this branch, which are a combination of the two trees. So for example, it would be taking the branch from a lemon tree and putting it on an apple tree and joining them together, so now you have a combination of a lemon and apple fruit. This is the second part of the mitzvah, that we're not allowed to do such a thing anywhere in the world. This mitzvah applies to all people. Where it applies, like we said, the first part about grafting seeds applies only in Eretz Yisrael. The second part about not grafting trees applies everywhere in all places. And then both parts of this mitzvah apply at all times, and for somebody who does do this avera, does go against this mitzvah, they are punished with malchus. The next mitzvah in this unit on page 13. Page 13. This page has two mitzvahs. Although they may look like one mitzvah, because they are in one mitzvah box, but really, as you could see from the numbers, 233 and 234, they are two mitzvahs that are just combined into one mitzvah box. The first mitzvah on this page is the mitzvah Shelo Lizroya Kilayim Bekerem Be'eretz Yisrael De'iraisa, which means do not plant grapevines with the seeds of any other grain or vegetable in Eretz Yisrael. This mitzvah is that we're not allowed to plant a grapevine together with other types of seeds. For example, planting a grapevine with a wheat kernel and a cucumber seed in Eretz Yisrael. This mitzvah applies to all people, applies only in Eretz Yisrael, applies at all times, and someone who is over this mitzvah, he violates this mitzvah and he does make such a plant in Eretz Yisrael, is punished with malchus. The second mitzvah on this page is Shaloi lechal kilei hakerem be'eretz Yisrael. Do not eat or benefit from a plant that grows from planting grape seeds together with other species in Eretz Yisrael. This mitzvah tells us that we're not allowed to eat or have any benefit from the plant that grows from planting a grapevine together with other species of produce. In the example we gave in the mitzvah before, we gave an example of planting a grapevine together with a wheat kernel and a cucumber seed. If someone did plant such a plant and this plant starts producing fruit, we are not allowed to eat that fruit or have any other types of benefit from that fruit. This mitzvah applies to all people, in all places, at all times. And a person who goes against this mitzvah and he eats or benefits from such a plant is punished with malchus. Unit 101, page 20. This page has two mitzvahs, and they are both mitzvahs lo yisaseh, mitzvahs which tell us what we are not allowed to do. The first mitzvah is Shillelagh harbia behema in min b'she'enei minei. Do not cause two different kinds of animals to have a baby together. The synopsis of this mitzvah is do not cause two different species of animals to have a baby together. This mitzvah is telling us that a person is not allowed to take two different kinds of animals, for example, a horse and a cow, and put them together so that way they should have children together, and these children will then be a mixture between a horse and a cow. This mitzvah applies to all people, it applies in all places, and it applies at all times. A person who is over and violates this mitzvah is punished with malchus. The second mitzvah is Shalei lasis malacha b'shnei minei behema. Do not use two different kinds of animals to work together. The synopsis of this mitzvah is do not use two animals of different species to work together. This mitzvah is telling us that we are not allowed to take two animals, for example, an ox and a donkey, and put them together to do a single work together. For example, we are not allowed to take an ox and a donkey and harness them to a wagon and have them pull the wagon together. This mitzvah applies to all people, in all places, and it applies at all times. Someone who is over and violates this mitzvah is punished with malchus. Unit 102, page 28. This page has one mitzvah, and this mitzvah is a mitzvah lo yisaseh, a mitzvah which tells us what we are not allowed to do. The mitzvah is shaloi lilbei shatnez, do not wear shatnez. The synopsis of this mitzvah is do not wear a piece of clothing that has linen and wool woven together. This mitzvah is telling us about shatnez. Shatnez is a garment or a piece of fabric that has wool and linen threads in it. The mitzvah is telling us that we are not allowed to wear any garment that has shatnez, wool and linen mixed together. And we are also not allowed to warm ourselves with any fabric, for example a blanket, that has wool and linen threads together. This mitzvah applies to all people, it applies in all places, and it applies at all times. A person who is over and violates this mitzvah is punished with malchus. Unit 103, page 37. This page has four mitzvahs, and they are all mitzvahs lo yisaseh, mitzvahs that tell us what we are not allowed to do. The first mitzvah, as you can see by the number 238, is shaloi lechalis hapea basada. Do not completely harvest the edge of your field. This mitzvah is telling us that when a person has a field which grows produce, for example, he is growing wheat in his field, and he is harvesting the field, he is cutting down the wheat that grew there, he is not allowed to cut down the entire field, including the corner. This corner is called peah in Lashon HaKodesh. This peah, this corner, is supposed to be left standing for the poor people to come and take the wheat for themselves. A person is not allowed to cut down the entire field, including that corner. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. A person who is over and violates this mitzvah is punished with malchus. The second mitzvah, as you can see by number 239, is shaloi lekachas shibolim haneflim b'shas hakatzer. Do not take stalks that fall when you are harvesting. This mitzvah, like the previous one, is talking about when someone is cutting down the grain that grew in his field. In this case, as the person was harvesting his field, some stalks fell out of his hand and they fell to the ground. This mitzvah tells us that we are not allowed to pick up those stalks and take them for ourselves. Rather, those stalks are supposed to be left on the ground for the poor people to come afterwards and take them for themselves. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. A person who is over and violates this mitzvah is punished with malchus. The third mitzvah, as you can see by number 240, is shaloi livtzer oilelos hakerem. Do not harvest the underdeveloped grape clusters in your vineyard. This mitzvah is referring to a person who is harvesting a vineyard. He is cutting the grapes that grew in his vineyard. As he's harvesting, he comes across clusters of grapes that did not fully develop. They are not fully formed as grapes. And the Torah tells us in this mitzvah that we are not allowed to cut down those grapes. Rather, we have to leave them hanging on the vine so that when the poor people come, they can come and take those underdeveloped grapes for themselves. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. A person who is over and violates this mitzvah is punished with malchus. The fourth mitzvah, as you can see by number 241, is Shillelagh peret hakeren. Do not collect the grapes that fell from your harvest. This mitzvah, like the previous one, is referring to a person who is harvesting grapes in a vineyard. In this case, as the person who was harvesting, cutting the grapes from the vine, some grapes fell to the ground. This mitzvah tells us that we are not allowed to pick up and collect those grapes for ourselves. Those grapes are supposed to be left on the ground, so when the poor people come to the vineyard, they can take those grapes for themselves. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. A person who is over, violates this mitzvah, is punished with malchus. Page 38. This page has 3 mitzvahs. The first mitzvah is a mitzvah shloisaseh, a mitzvah which tells us what we are not allowed to do. This mitzvah is shaloi likach emer hashikcha mitavua oimei ilonis, not to take the remaining sheaf that you have forgotten in the field or from the trees. The synopsis of this mitzvah is to not take the remaining sheaf that you have forgotten in the field or from the trees. This mitzvah tells us that when a person is harvesting his field, or he is harvesting fruits from trees, and he is gathering them together in bundles, and he's bringing them home, or to his storehouse, this person then remembers that he forgot one bundle back at the field. This mitzvah tells us that the person is not allowed to go back to take that forgotten bundle of fruit or grain. That bundle of fruit or grain is supposed to stay in the field for the poor people to come and take once the owner has finished harvesting his field. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. A person who is over, violates this mitzvah, is punished with malchus. The second mitzvah is a mitzvah saseh, a mitzvah which tells us what we have to do. This mitzvah, as you can read by number 243, is mitzvah's payah, the mitzvah to leave payah, the edge of the field, for the poor and the stranger. This mitzvah is telling us that when a person is harvesting his field of grain, he has to leave the corner, which, as we said before, is called payah in Lashon HaKodesh. He has to leave that payah for the poor people to collect when they come through the field after the owner has finished harvesting. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. The third mitzvah is a mitzvah saseh, a mitzvah that tells us what we have to do. This mitzvah, as you can see by number 244, is mitzvah's leket, the mitzvah to leave leket, the stalks that have fallen, for the poor and the stranger. This mitzvah is telling us that when we harvest a field, and some of the stalks of grain fall out of our hands onto the ground, we have to leave those stalks on the ground so that way the poor people can take those stalks for themselves. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. Page 39. This page has 3 mitzvahs, and they are all mitzvahs aseh, mitzvahs that tell us what we have to do. The first mitzvah, as you can see by the number 245, is mitzvahs hanachas oilules hakeren, the mitzvah to leave oilules of the vineyard, the underdeveloped clusters of grapes, for the poor and the stranger. This mitzvah tells us that when a person is harvesting a vineyard, he is cutting the grapes off the vines, and there are some grapes that are underdeveloped. They have not yet fully grown into fully mature grapes. He has a mitzvah to leave those grapes connected to the vine, so that way the poor people could come and take those grapes for themselves. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. The second mitzvah, as you can see by number 246, is mitzvah's hanachas peret hakeren, the mitzvah to leave peret of the vineyard, the fallen grapes, for the poor and the stranger. This mitzvah is telling us that when a person is harvesting grapes, cutting the grapes off the vines, and some grapes fell to the ground, he has to leave those grapes on the ground so that way the poor people can come and take those grapes for themselves after the owner has finished harvesting the grapes in his vineyard. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. The third mitzvah, as you can see by number 247, is mitzvahs hanochas imrei hashikha, the mitzvah to leave shikha, the forgotten bundles, for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. This mitzvah is telling us that when a person is harvesting grain or fruit from his field, and after he gathered them into bundles and brought them out of the field, he remembers that he forgot a bundle left in the field. This mitzvah tells us that he has to leave the bundle in the field, so that way the poor people could come and take that bundle for themselves after the owner has finished harvesting his field. This mitzvah applies to all people, only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. Unit 104, page 48. This page has one mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah aseh, a mitzvah that tells us what we have to do. This mitzvah is mitzvahs ma'aser ani b'shana shalishis. Give 1/10 of your crops to the poor in the 3rd and 6th year of Shemitah. The synopsis of this mitzvah is give 1/10 of your crops to poor people in the 3rd and the 6th years of Shemitah. To understand this mitzvah, we first need to understand the Shemitah cycle and the different matanes, the different portions of produce that are given to different people. Every 7 years, Eretz Yisrael goes through a Shemitah cycle, during which the first 6 years the land is worked, and in the 7th year it is forbidden to work the land at all. Each year of the 6 years the land is worked. 1/10 of the produce that grows and is harvested from the land is separated and given to a Levi. This is called Meiser Rishon, the first Meiser. Another 1/10 of the crop is then separated, called Meiser Sheni, the second Meiser. In the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th years of the Shemitah cycle, the owner takes the crops that are separated from Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim, where he, his family, and his friends eat the produce. This mitzvah is telling us that in the 3rd and 6th years of the Shemitah cycle, the second Meiser is not brought to Yerushalayim. Instead, the owner has a mitzvah to give the crops to the poor. This is called Meiser Ani, the 10%, the 10th of the produce that is given for the poor people. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. Unit 105, page 56. This page has 2 mitzvahs. The first mitzvah is a mitzvah aseh, a mitzvah that tells us what we have to do. This mitzvah is mitzvah's tzedakah, the mitzvah of giving tzedakah. The synopsis of this mitzvah is give tzedakah to poor people. This mitzvah tells us that we are obligated to give to a person who needs. This could be money, it could be food, it could be clothing, or it could be anything that the person might need. This mitzvah is called tzedakah, and it applies to all people, it applies in all places, and it applies at all times. The second mitzvah is a mitzvah sloisase, a mitzvah that tells us what we are not allowed to do. This mitzvah is shaloilim noyam al hachiyas ha'ani umilitin loy mashu tzarich. Do not hold back from giving a poor person what he needs. The synopsis of the mitzvah is do not hold back from giving tzedakah to a poor person. This mitzvah is the counterpart, the partner of the previous mitzvah. This mitzvah tells us that we are not allowed to hold back if a poor person or someone who needs something comes to us and asks us for help. We are not allowed to ignore the person and not give them the help that they need. This mitzvah applies to all people, it applies in all places, and it applies at all times. If a person is over, violates this mitzvah, there is no punishment from Beis Din. Unit 106, page 66. This page has 1 mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah aseh, a mitzvah that tells us what we have to do. This mitzvah is mitzvah hafrashas teruma gedolah. Give teruma from your produce to the kohen. The synopsis of this mitzvah is give a portion of your produce to the kohen. This mitzvah tells us that when growing produce in Eretz Yisrael, we are obligated to separate a portion of that produce and give it to a kohen. This portion that we separate and give to a kohen is called teruma. This mitzvah applies only to Yisraelim. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. Page 67. This page has 2 mitzvahs. The first mitzvah is a mitzvah aseh, a mitzvah that tells us what we have to do. This mitzvah is mitzvah halaviyim lasis meiser min hameiser, A Levi must give 1/10 of the Meiser that he receives to the Kohen. The synopsis of this mitzvah is a Levi must give 1/10 of the produce he gets as Meiser to the Kohen. Earlier we learned that when a Yid harvests his field, he must separate 10% of the produce and give it to a Levi. That 10% is called Meiser Rishon. This mitzvah that we're learning now is telling us that once the Levi receives the Meiser Rishon, he has to separate 10% of the Meiser Rishon and give it to a Kohen. This mitzvah applies to Leviim, it applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. The second mitzvah is a mitzvah Shloisaseh, a mitzvah that tells us what we are not allowed to do. This mitzvah is Shillelagh Chulki HaTvuos. Do not separate the Truma and Meiser out of order. The synopsis of this mitzvah is do not separate the gifts of your produce out of order. This mitzvah tells us that we are not allowed to change the order that the Torah has set for giving Truma and Meiser. The order that Torah has set is that first a Yid must separate Truma from his crops and give it to a Kohen. Then he must separate the first 10% of his crop, known as Meiser Rishon, and give it to a Levi. And then he must separate the second 10% of his crops, and in some years this is going to be eaten in Yerushalayim, and it is called Meiser Sheni, and in other years it is given away to a poor person, and it is known as Meiser Ani. This mitzvah tells us that we are not allowed to change this order that the Torah has set. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael. It applies when most Jews are in Eretz Yisrael. And someone who is over, violates this mitzvah, receives no punishment from Beis Din. Unit 107. In this unit, we're going to learn about who is not allowed to eat Truma. In the previous unit, we learned that a farmer who grows produce in Eretz Yisrael has to separate a portion of that produce and give it to a Kohen. That portion that he separated and gave to the Kohen is called Truma. In this unit, we're going to learn about who is not allowed to eat Truma. Page 76. On this page, there are 3 mitzvahs. Now, it may look like they're all one mitzvah because there's only one mitzvah box on the page. However, if you look carefully, in the left column of the mitzvah box, you see different numbers, because there are really 3 mitzvahs that are included in one mitzvah box. The first mitzvah is a mitzvah Shloisaseh, and this mitzvah is Shelo Yechal Shum Zar Teruma. Do not eat teruma if you are not a kohen. This mitzvah tells us that any yid who is not a kohen is not allowed to eat teruma. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews live in Eretz Yisrael. The punishment for someone who is over, violates this mitzvah, is misa b'dei shemayim. This means that his punishment is that he passes away not by Beis Din people putting him to death, but rather from Hashem makes him pass away. The second mitzvah is also a mitzvah Shloisaseh. This mitzvah is Shelo Yechal Teishav Kohen V'Sacher Teruma. Do not eat teruma if you're not a kohen, even if you live in his house or work for him. This mitzvah tells us that even a yid who lives in a kohen's house or does work for him is still not allowed to eat teruma if he himself is not a kohen. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews live in Eretz Yisrael. If a yid is over, violates this mitzvah, he is punished with misa b'dei shemayim. The third mitzvah is also a mitzvah Shloisaseh. This mitzvah is Shelo Yechal Arel Teruma. Do not eat teruma if you have not had a bris milah. This mitzvah tells us that a kohen who has not had a bris milah is not allowed to eat teruma. This mitzvah applies only to kohanim. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews live in Eretz Yisrael. If a kohen is over this avera, this mitzvah, his punishment is malchus. Page 77. This page has 2 mitzvahs, and they are both mitzvahs Shloisaseh. The first mitzvah is Shelo Yechal Kohen Tamei Teruma. A kohen who is tamei is not allowed to eat teruma. The synopsis of this mitzvah is do not eat teruma while tamei. This mitzvah tells us that a kohen who is tamei is not allowed to eat teruma. This mitzvah applies only to kohanim. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews live in Eretz Yisrael. If a kohen is over, violates this mitzvah, he is punished with misa b'dei shamayim. The second mitzvah is a mitzvah shaloi teichal chalola min hakodesh. The daughter of a kohen who marries a non-kohen is not allowed to eat truma. The synopsis of this mitzvah is a bas kohen who married a non-kohen is not allowed to eat truma. This mitzvah tells us that the daughter of a kohen who marries someone who is not a kohen is not allowed to eat truma. This mitzvah applies to females, to women. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews live in Eretz Yisrael. The punishment for being over, for violating this mitzvah, is malchus. Unit 108, page 84. This page has one mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah saseh. This mitzvah is mitzvahs ma'aser rishon. Give 1/10 of your crop to a Levi. The synopsis of this mitzvah is separate 1/10 of your crop and give it to a Levi. As we learned earlier, there are different portions that a person has to separate from his crop and give to different people. This mitzvah is telling us that after a person separates the teruma and gives it to a kohen, he has to separate 1/10, 10% of the crop that remains after he took truma, and he has to give that 10% to a Levi. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. Unit 109. In this unit, we're going to learn about Ma'aser Sheni. As we learned earlier, after a person separates 1/10% of his produce and gives it to a Levi, there's another 1/10 that the person has to separate. And in some years of the Shemitah cycle, he has to take that 10% to Yerushalayim and eat it there. And in those years, it is called Ma'aser Sheni, the second Ma'aser. In other years, he has to take that second 10% and give it away to poor people. In those years, it is called Ma'aser Ani, the poor person's Ma'aser. Page 92. This page has one mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah saseh. This mitzvah is mitzvahs Ma'aser Sheni. Separate 1/10 of your produce as Ma'aser Sheni. The synopsis of this mitzvah is separate 1/10 of your produce as Ma'aser Sheni after you have given Ma'aser Rishon. This mitzvah tells us that after a person separates Ma'aser Rishon from his produce, he has to separate a second 10% of the produce. This time, he takes this second 10% and he brings it to Yerushalayim, where he has a mitzvah to eat it with special halachas. This 10% that he brings to Yerushalayim is called Ma'aser Sheni. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. Page 93. This page has 3 mitzvahs, and they're all mitzvahs lo yisaseh. The first mitzvah, as you can see by number 261, is Shillelagh Ma'aser Sheni ba'aninus. Do not eat Ma'aser Sheni while you are in Oinei. This mitzvah tells us that a Yid who is chas v'shalom in Oinei, meaning that a close relative of his, either a sibling, a parent, a child, or a spouse, has passed away and was not yet buried. In such a case, the person is not allowed to eat Ma'aser Sheni. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies in Yerushalayim, and it applies when most Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. If a Yid is over, he violates this mitzvah, he is punished with malchus. The second mitzvah, by number 262, is Shillelagh Ma'aser Sheni b'tumah. Do not eat Ma'aser Sheni that has become impure, and do not eat Ma'aser Sheni while you are impure. This mitzvah tells us that a Yid is not allowed to eat Ma'aser Sheni if either him or the Ma'aser Sheni are tamei. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies in Yerushalayim, and it applies when most Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. If a Yid is over this mitzvah, he is punished with malchus. The third mitzvah, by number 263, is Shillelagh Ha'itzi Dmei Ma'aser Sheni b'sha'ar dvarim she'einam me'achilo shasiyah. Do not spend the value of the money from Ma'aser Sheni on anything other than food or drink. Sometimes, in certain situations, for example, if a person has too much produce to bring with him to Yerushalayim for Ma'aser Sheni, or he is afraid that by the time he comes to Yerushalayim, the produce will be rotten and he won't be able to eat it there, the Torah allows the person to exchange, to sell that produce for money, and then bring the money to Yerushalayim, and use that money to buy food and drink in Yerushalayim, and eat that food and drink as Ma'aser Sheni. This mitzvah tells us that when a person does make such an exchange, and he is spending the money in Yerushalayim, he's not allowed to spend the money on anything other than food or drink. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies in Yerushalayim, and it applies when most Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. If a Yid is over, violates this mitzvah, he is punished with Malchus. Page 94. This page has 3 mitzvahs, and they are all mitzvahs lo yisaseh. Earlier we learned that Ma'aser Sheni has to be eaten inside of Yerushalayim. These 3 mitzvahs all tell us that we are not allowed to eat Ma'aser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim. The difference between these 3 mitzvahs is that the first mitzvah is telling us specifically about Ma'aser Sheni that was separated from grain, that we are not allowed to eat that Ma'aser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim. The second mitzvah tells us specifically about Ma'aser Sheni that was separated from wine, that we're not allowed to eat that Ma'aser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim. And the third mitzvah tells us specifically about Ma'aser Sheni that was separated from oil, that we are not allowed to eat that Ma'aser Sheni either outside of Yerushalayim. Now to do these 3 mitzvahs inside the book. The first mitzvah, by number 264 on the page, is the Shillelagh Ma'aser Sheni Shal Dagan Chutz Yerushalayim. Do not eat Ma'aser Sheni of grain outside of Yerushalayim. This mitzvah tells us that we are not allowed to eat Ma'aser Sheni that was separated from grain. We are not allowed to eat the Ma'aser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies in all places, and it applies when most Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. If the Yid is over, violates this mitzvah, he is punished with Malchus. The second mitzvah, by number 265 on the page, is Shillelagh Ma'aser Sheni Shal Tirosh Chutz Yerushalayim. Do not eat Ma'aser Sheni of wine outside of Yerushalayim. This mitzvah tells us that we are not allowed to eat Ma'aser Sheni that was separated from wine. We're not allowed to eat that Ma'aser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies in all places, and it applies when most Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. If a Yid is over, violates this mitzvah, he is punished with Malchus. The third mitzvah, by number 266 on the page, is Shillelagh Ma'aser Sheni Shal Yitzar Chutz Yerushalayim. Do not eat Ma'aser Sheni of oil outside of Yerushalayim. This mitzvah tells us that we are not allowed to eat Ma'aser Sheni that was separated from oil. We are not allowed to eat that Ma'aser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies in all places, and it applies when most Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. If a Yid is over, violates this mitzvah, he is punished with Malchus. Unit 110, page 102. This page has 1 mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah saseh. This mitzvah is mitzvahs netar revoi. Netar revoi. The synopsis of this mitzvah is the fruit that grows on a tree in its 4th year after being planted must be eaten in Yerushalayim. The fruits that grow from a tree during the first 3 years after it was planted are called arla, and we are not allowed to eat or benefit from them in any way. The fruits that grow in the 4th year after planting are called netar revoi. These fruits are holy and have to be eaten in Yerushalayim with the same halachas that apply to Ma'aser Sheni. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. Unit 111, page 110. This page has 1 mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah saseh. This mitzvah is mitzvahs vidui ma'aser, the proclamations said with ma'aser. The synopsis of this mitzvah is twice every 7 years, declare that you have given all of the necessary trumas and maasers. This mitzvah tells us that twice in every Shemitah cycle, twice every 7 years, a Yid has to declare that he has given all the trumas and maasers that Hashem has commanded us to give. In order to be able to say Vidu Maiser, the Yid may not have any trumas, maasros, bikurim, which we'll learn about in a future unit, or netar avoi in his possession. This mitzvah applies only to men. It applies in all places, and it applies at all times. Unit 112, page 116. This page has one mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah saseh. This mitzvah is mitzvahs havas bikurim. Bring the first of your shivas haminim to the Beis Hamikdash. The synopsis of this mitzvah is bring the first crops of your shivas haminim to the Beis Hamikdash. This mitzvah tells us that when a yid grows shivas haminim, fruits or grain, in his field in Eretz Yisrael, he is obligated to bring the first of those fruits or grain to the Beis Hamikdash and give it to a kohen. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies during the times of the Beis Hamikdash. Page 117. This page has two mitzvahs. The first mitzvah is a mitzvah saseh. This mitzvah is Shillelagh ha-kohen bikurim chutz li-Yerushalayim. A kohen is not allowed to eat bikurim outside of Yerushalayim. The synopsis of this mitzvah is do not eat bikurim outside of Yerushalayim. This mitzvah tells us that the kohen, once he receives the bikurim, is not allowed to eat those bikurim outside of Yerushalayim. This mitzvah applies only to kohanim. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies during the times of the Beis Hamikdash. If a kohen is over, violates this mitzvah, he is punished with malchus. The second mitzvah is a mitzvah saseh. This mitzvah is mitzvahs kriya al ha-bikurim, thanking Hashem for the bikurim. The synopsis of this mitzvah is thank Hashem with words when bringing the bikurim. This mitzvah tells us that when a yid brings bikurim to the Beis Hamikdash, he must say certain psukim to express his thanks to Hashem. This mitzvah applies only to men. It applies only in the Beis Hamikdash, and it applies during the times of the Beis Hamikdash. Unit 113, page 128. This page has one mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah saseh. This mitzvah is mitzvah's challah, separating challah. The synopsis of this mitzvah is separate a portion of your dough for a kohen. This mitzvah tells us that when a yid owns a dough that was kneaded, he is obligated to give a portion of that dough to a kohen. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are living in Eretz Yisrael. Unit 114, page 136. This page has two mitzvahs, and they are both mitzvahs aseh. The first mitzvah is mitzvahs matanei zeroya lechayayim v'keva lakoyim, giving the front leg, the jaw, and the fourth stomach of a kosher animal to a kohen. The synopsis of this mitzvah is give the front leg, the jaw, and the fourth stomach to a kohen when you shech a kosher animal. This mitzvah tells us that when a yid shechs a kosher animal, he must give 3 parts of the animal to a kohen. The first part is called the zeroya, which refers to the front right leg. The second part is called lichayayim. These refer to the cheeks. The third part is called a keva. This refers to the fourth stomach of a kosher animal. Kosher animals have 4 separate stomach compartments to help them digest their food properly. The fourth stomach compartment is called the keva, and that is what the yid is obligated to give to a kohen. This mitzvah applies only to Yisraelim. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. The second mitzvah is mitzvahs reishis hagez sheinasim lakohen, giving the kohen the first shearing of wool that you shear from your sheep. The synopsis of this mitzvah is give the kohen the first shearing of wool that you shear from your sheep. This mitzvah tells us that whenever a Levi or a Yisrael shears, which means cuts, the wool from his sheep, he has to give the first portion of that wool to a kohen. This mitzvah applies to Leviim and Yisraelim only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies at all times. Unit 115, page 144. This page has one mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah saseh. This mitzvah is mitzvahs pidyon b'cher adam, redeeming the firstborn son. The synopsis of this mitzvah is redeem your son, the firstborn of his Jewish mother. This mitzvah tells us that when a woman has her first child, her first baby, and that child is a boy, the father must redeem the child from a kohen by giving the kohen the value of 5 saloim of silver. Saloim is a certain type of coin. This mitzvah applies only to male Yisraelim. It applies in all places, and it applies at all times. Page 145. This page has 2 mitzvahs, and they are both mitzvahs aseh. The first mitzvah, by number 276, is mitzvahs pidyon peter chaber, redeem the firstborn male of a donkey. This mitzvah tells us that when a female donkey gives birth to her first child, and that child is a male, the owner of this firstborn male donkey has to exchange the male donkey with a sheep or goat, and give the sheep or goat to a kohen. This mitzvah applies only to Yisraelim. It applies in all places, and it applies at all times. The second mitzvah, by number 277, is mitzvah sarifas peter chamer, behead an unredeemed firstborn male donkey. This mitzvah tells us that if the owner of the firstborn male donkey does not want to redeem it, which means exchange it with a sheep or a goat, and give the sheep or goat to a kohen, then he has a mitzvah to cut off the head of the firstborn male donkey. This mitzvah applies only to Yisraelim. It applies in all places, and it applies at all times. Unit 116, page 154. This page has one mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah saseh. This mitzvah is mitzvahs shemitas karkois. Give up ownership of your land's produce every 7th year. The synopsis of this mitzvah is give up ownership of all your land's produce in the Shemitah year. Earlier, we learned that in Eretz Yisrael, there are years called Shemitah cycles. These are cycles of 7 years, during which the first 6 years, Yidden are allowed to work the land and harvest them, and in the 7th year, they have to let go and allow the land to rest. This mitzvah tells us that during the Shemitah year, the 7th year, we are commanded to pronounce all the produce in our fields as hefker, ownerless. This means that we do not own them anymore and they are free for anyone to take. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are in Eretz Yisrael. Page 155. This page has 3 mitzvahs. The first mitzvah is a mitzvah saseh. This mitzvah is mitzvahs shevisas haaretz b'shnas hashmita. Stop working the land during the 7th year. The synopsis of this mitzvah is stop working the land during the 7th year. This mitzvah tells us that during the Shemitah year, the 7th year of the Shemitah cycle, we are commanded to stop working the land. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are in Eretz Yisrael. The second mitzvah is a mitzvah sleisase. This mitzvah, by number 280, is Shalei Navid Ha'adama B'Shana HaShavius. Do not plant anything in your land during the Shemitah year. This mitzvah tells us that during the Shemitah year, we are not allowed to plant anything in our land. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are in Eretz Yisrael. If a Yid violates his over this mitzvah, then he is punished with malchus. The third mitzvah is also a mitzvah sleisase. This mitzvah, by number 281, is Shalei Navid Aveda Gam Be'ilanos. Do not prune your trees during the Shemitah year. This mitzvah tells us that during the Shemitah year, we are also not allowed to work our trees, such as pruning, which means to cut the branches that are dead from a tree, so that way the tree can grow better. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are in Eretz Yisrael. If a Yid is over violates this mitzvah, he is punished with malchus. Page 156. This page has 5 mitzvahs, and they're all mitzvahs sleisase. The first mitzvah, by number 282, is Shalei Nikzer Svichim B'Shana HaShvius. Do not harvest the crops that grow during the Shemitah year. This mitzvah is talking about svichim. Svichim are crops that grow without having been planted by a person. They could grow from seeds that fall from a tree, for example, or perhaps a wind blew the seeds into the field. This mitzvah tells us that during Shemitah, we are not allowed to harvest, cut these svichim plants in the regular way of harvesting. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are in Eretz Yisrael. If a Yid is over violates this mitzvah, he is punished with malchus. The second mitzvah, by number 283, is Shalei Nasoif Pereis Ha'ilon B'Shavius Kederech Sha'is V'Oisan B'Chol Shana. Do not harvest fruits that grow during the Shemitah year. This mitzvah tells us that we are not allowed to cut down fruits that grow during Shemitah year in the regular way that they are harvested. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are in Eretz Yisrael. If a Yiddish Oiver violates this mitzvah, he is punished with Malchus. The third mitzvah, by number 284, is Sholoi Na'aved Ha'aretz B'Shnas HaYovel. Do not work the land during the Yovel year. Yovel is a year that comes after 7 complete Shemitah cycles. 7 complete Shemitah cycles totals 49 years. The next year, the 50th year, is called Yovel. This year is a holy year. And just like at Shemitah, we have to let go and let the land rest. So too, during the Yovel year, we have to let go and let the land rest. This mitzvah tells us that during the Yovel year, we are not allowed to work the land. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are in Eretz Yisrael. If a Yiddish Oiver violates this mitzvah, he is punished with Malchus. The fourth mitzvah, by number 285, is Shaloi Nikzer Svichei Tvois Shal Shnas HaYovel. Do not harvest the crops that grow during the Yovel year. Earlier we learned that during the Shemitah year, we are not allowed to harvest Svichim, crops that grow from the ground on their own. We are not allowed to harvest them in the regular way. This mitzvah tells us that during Yovel, we are also not allowed to harvest Svichim in the regular way. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are in Eretz Yisrael. If a Yiddish Oiver violates this mitzvah, he is punished with Malchus. The last mitzvah, by number 286, is Shaloi La'asayf Peris HaIlanis B'Shnas HaYovel K'derech Sha'is Ben Eisan B'Shar Shana. Do not harvest fruits that grow during the Yovel year. Earlier we learned that during the year of Shemitah, we are not allowed to harvest, cut, fruits that grow during Shemitah in the regular way of harvesting. This mitzvah tells us that during Yovel, we are also not allowed to harvest fruits in the regular way of harvesting. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies only in Eretz Yisrael, and it applies when most Jews are in Eretz Yisrael. If a Yiddish Oiver violates this mitzvah, he is punished with Malchus. Unit 117. This unit talks about Shemitah's Ksafim. What is Shemitah's Ksafim? If someone lends money to another person, but does not specify when the money must be paid back, the debt is cancelled at the end of the Shemitah year. This is called Shemitah's Ksafim, releasing ownership of money debts. Page 168. This page has 2 mitzvahs. The first mitzvah is a mitzvah Shaloi Saseh. This mitzvah is Shaloi L'Tvaya Halva She'avra Leha Shaviz. Do not claim a loan after a Shemitah year has passed. The synopsis of this mitzvah is do not demand payment of a loan after a Shemitah year has passed. This mitzvah tells us that after a Shemitah year has passed, a lender is not allowed to demand payment from the borrower for a loan which he lent to this person before Shemitah. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies in all places, and it applies at all times. If a Yiddish Oiver violates this mitzvah, there is no punishment. The second mitzvah is a mitzvah Saseh. This mitzvah is mitzvah Sashmatas Kesafim Bashana Hashaviz. Cancel all of your loans in the Shemitah year. The synopsis of this mitzvah is cancel your loans in the Shemitah year. This mitzvah tells us that during the Shemitah year, a lender is obligated to cancel all the loans that he lent to other people. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies in all places, and it applies at all times. Page 169. This page has 1 mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah Shaloi Saseh. This mitzvah is Shaloi Nimna Melahalves La'ani Mipnei HaShemitah. Do not hold back from giving a loan to a poor person before a Shemitah year. The synopsis of this mitzvah is don't hold back from giving a loan to a poor man before a Shemitah year. This mitzvah tells us that we are not allowed to hold back from lending money to someone who needs it because we know that a Shemitah year is coming shortly. This mitzvah applies to all people. It applies in all places, and it applies at all times. If a Yiddish Oiver violates this mitzvah, there is no punishment.